Oh, hello, world. Welcome to God's Kitchen Table, an episode with myself, Lily Price, Elise Alford, Ethan Cruvula, and William. I don't know your last name. Um, Today, we are going to be starting a series on violence and stuff like that. So, today we have Mia Alford, we have William, and we have Luke Cruvula. And yeah, take it away, guys.
To introduce my position, I would say that according to the Bible, I believe that there are circumstances where killing is justified. The Bible allows for certain circumstances where killing is justified. I'd say some of my biblical support for this position would be Ecclesiastes 3 1 through 8. I'll just read it quickly, but it says, "There's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time for hate, a time for war and a time for peace." So here there are two specific instances that talk about killing and a time. There's a time to kill and a time to heal. I would take these both literally, as in talking there is an actual time to kill and a time to heal. And then in the second part, it says there's a time for war and a time for peace. So that would be one example in the Bible that I see to support that position, as well as Genesis 9 5 through 6. It says, "And for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting for every animal, and from each human being, too, I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being." So God is saying here in this that a human being, he demands an accounting for the life of another human being. So, like, we're responsible for someone else. And then it says, "Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind." So it specifically stated that someone who sheds human blood, their blood will also be shed by humans. So those are the two verses that I would go to. There's other support, and hopefully we can talk through some of those verses throughout the debate as well. And as far as self-defense, this one is a little bit more broad, but I think as far as like an opening statement, I don't see the Bible anywhere forbidding self-defense. I could change my position on that. But so far, I don't see anywhere in the Bible where self-defense is forbidden, and the Bible does not call us to be vulnerable. I think the Bible calls us to be wise and to spread the gospel. And I think in order to do both of those things, that self-defense could be necessary in a situation. So yeah, that would be my introduction.
I'll respond to that. So my position is that, sorry, my voice sounds weird because I have a sore throat and woke up early. But my position is that Christians should not have a part in using deadly force against others. That in cases where that's needed, that could be the government's role, but Christians shouldn't be involved in the government for similar reasons. I think the first useful verse that deals with this is Matthew 5:38 through 48. I'll read that once I find it. "You have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if any man will sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain. Give to him that asketh thee, and for him that would borrow of thee, turn not away. Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. For if ye love them which love you, what reward have ye? Do not even the publicans do the same? And if ye salute your brethren only, what do ye more than others? Do not even the publicans so? Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. So, I think the most obvious reading of this verse, without going into like exegetical gymnastics, is that we're called to actually not resist an evildoer, that we're called to love our enemies, and that isn't going to include that cannot include killing them. This isn't the same thing as just being a coward, though. If someone slaps you on one cheek, it's not easy to turn the other to them. It's a lot easier to run away or to respond. Here are a few more verses that can support this position. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. That's Matthew 10:16. Matthew 26:52. But Jesus said to him, Put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Romans 12. Repay no one evil for evil. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. By doing so, you will heap coals of fire on his head. 2 Corinthians 10:4. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh. 1 Thessalonians 5:15. See that no one renders evil for evil to anyone. Revelation 13:10. For he who kills with a sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and faith of the saints. I think all of these together are a strong argument that there are three. I think you can say that there are three kinds of people in the world. Fundamentally, there are going to be those who break peace. They stir up controversy, dissension, violence where they go. I'm sure everyone here can think of people like that. Then there are those who fake peace. They ignore the dissension, unrest, and violence around them, but just stand back, ignore it. It's not our problem. Then there are those who make peace. They find unrest and strife, and respond with nonviolence. Peacemakers sacrifice their own comfort by loving their enemies. Then, from those are the main biblical verses that deal with my argument. But I think from a historical perspective, the church's use of violence has been responsible for a tremendous amount of evil. From the Crusades, which whatever we think about them, like it's clearly bad to kill fellow Christians and kill thousands of women and children, to the rise of Hitler, which was fueled by Christian ideology. That these are all examples of where the church has failed in encouraging and accepting and going along with violence. So this is a quote from a man named George Zabelka, who was the chaplain of the airmen who dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Someone asked him, "You said that the atomic bombing of Nagasaki happened to a church that asked for it. What do you mean by that?" Zabelka responds, "For the first 3 centuries, the 3 centuries closest to Christ, the church was a pacifist church. With Constantine, the church accepted the pagan Roman ethic of a just war and slowly began to involve its membership in mass slaughter, first for the state, so fighting against the barbarians or whatever, and later for the faith. Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants, whatever other differences they may have had, all agreed that Jesus' clear and unambiguous teaching on the rejection of violence and our love of enemies was not to be taken seriously. And so, each of the major branches of Christianity, by different theological methods, modified our Lord's teaching in these matters until all 3 were able to do what Jesus rejected. That is, take an eye for an eye, slaughter, maim, and torture. It seems a sign to me that 1700 years of Christian terror and slaughter should arrive at August 9th, 1945, when Catholics dropped the atom bomb on top of the largest and first Catholic city in Japan. One would think that I, as a Catholic priest, would have spoken out against atomic bombing of nuns. 3 orders of Catholic sisters were destroyed in Nagasaki that day. One would have thought that I would have suggested that as a minimal standard of Catholic morality, Catholics shouldn't bomb Catholic children. I didn't. So the thing here is that Christianity's use of violence has been responsible for so much, and then beyond that, violence doesn't just happen as a bad thing and then we end, but violence begets more violence. Those who are oppressed try to oppress others in turn, and it's an eternal vicious cycle. Responding to your 2 verses about from Ecclesiastes 3:1-8, I would say that's not that saying that there's a time for everything doesn't necessarily imply that any of that those activities are all good ones. It's just like, is there a time to break things? I mean, maybe, kind of, I don't know. Then in response to the Genesis one, God says at the Noahic covenant that whoever sheds blood, by man shall his blood be shed. This isn't kind of as quite a high bar as Christ sets in the New Testament, but it is. This Genesis passage is saying that, like, there is something even here that God holds sacred of the life of man, and that it can't just be shed with impunity.
Ecclesiastes, like the last few weeks, I'm going to start with the Old Testament, move into the New Testament, and then kind of conclude with both. So like Mia mentioned, the Ecclesiastes 3:1-3 passage, Luke, your rebuttal to this was may or may not be a time to break things, but a time to break things is in the list. And Ecclesiastes, for the most part, many people agree was written by the wisest man, Solomon. And even if it wasn't, it's still inspired by God. So the fact that Solomon says that there is a time to kill, I think means something. Before moving on, I think there's an important distinction that needs to be made between murder, self-defense, and war. Those are all 3 very different things, and God treated all 3 things very differently. And like you said, I mean, anything can be corrupted in any way. So just because I'm going to argue for some justified killing and some like participation in the military, that does not mean that I'm agreeing with and condoning every other action like the Crusades or even Nazi Germany. Those were all things that should not have happened and were evil events. So it's not a false dichotomy. It's not you're either for it or you're against it. There's some gray area, and you need to use your moral code to decide, okay, this is not okay, this is okay. So starting off, Exodus 2:12 through chapter 3, verse 10. I'm not going to read all of that, but instead I'm going to read Stephen's speech to the Sanhedrin, where he references this in Acts 7. Acts 7:20-27. Shall start in verse 23, so I'm not talking this long. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day, Moses came upon 2 Israelites who were fighting, who tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you are brothers, why do you hurt each other?" So this is one instance in the New Testament that references an Old Testament event where it shows somebody using, it's not exactly self-defense, it's self-defense for another person. It's protecting the other person. It ends in vengeance by death because Moses killed the Egyptian who was beating the Israelite. And then just kind of many other passages in the Old Testament, like the entirety of Deuteronomy 20 was written on war. Israel obviously fought many wars that were directed by God, and then afterwards they fought wars. David fought wars that were clearly not sinful, and Solomon, I believe, did too. Now, obviously, when the Assyrians and Babylonians invaded, that was God using other nations to conquer Israel. But you can see very clearly in the Old Testament that war and killing of itself is not sinful. In addition, Exodus 22:2-3, this is a cool little passage. I'll start in verse 1 actually. Whoever steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. If a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed. So this is one of the most direct self-defense passages. Thief caught breaking in at night struck a fatal blow. I also think this passage is cool because the state of Texas actually has the exact same law. If somebody breaks into your house, you are allowed to shoot them if they're running away in the dark at night because you can't see them. If you do it during the day, then I believe you're guilty of one of them, like manslaughter first degree, I think. But anyways, that was a cool modern application of this verse. But that says God justified killing of a thief breaking in and you defending yourself and striking a fatal blow when it can't be avoided at night when you can't see well. But yeah, like I said, in the Old Testament, there's an important distinction between murder, self-defense, and war. Cities of refuge play a big part of that. I could go deeper into that, but I'm going to move into the New Testament. And for the New Testament, this is going to be more on the participation in the military side of things, because I think it's important for us to see how centurions and soldiers were treated and commanded by Jesus and the apostles. So I'm going to start off in Luke 7, 1 through 10. I'm going to spend a lot of time in Luke today. Luke is before John, not after. Goodness gracious, it's too early in the morning for me to be doing this. All right, so Luke 7, 1 through 10 is the same passage is reciprocated in Matthew 8, 5 through 10, but this is the centurion demonstrating his faith to Christ, asking for his servant to be healed. Jesus is heading to the centurion after the people verify that the centurion is a good man. Centurion sends out a different servant saying, "Don't come under my roof. I'm not worthy for you to come near me." Jesus says in verse 9, "I tell you, I've not found such great faith in Israel," and he heals his servant. In all of this, Jesus does not tell the centurion, stop being a centurion, stop your participation in the military. Flip back a few chapters, I skipped my first point actually. Luke 3, 12 through 14, this is John the Baptist and the hordes that were going to him to be taught and to be baptized. In verse 12, even tax collectors came to be baptized. "Teacher," they said, "what should we do?" He tells them, "Don't collect any more than you are required to." In verse 14, then some soldiers asked him, "And what should we do?" He replied, "Don't extort money and don't accuse people falsely. Be content with your pay." So both here, for the tax collectors and the soldiers, he does not say, and these were jobs that were, still today, but even more so maybe back then, that were very easily corruptible and very easily could have led to sin eventually. John the Baptist doesn't tell them, stop being soldiers, find another job, what you're doing is sinful. He says, don't extort money and be content with the pay that you're being paid to be a soldier. Flipping now to the right, a few chapters. As a general rule, I haven't seen any other place where he does something like this, but Christ uses parables and comparisons that aren't sinful, if that makes sense. Like, yes, in his parables, like the prodigal son, there is sin in his parables, but his parables and comparisons aren't only about sin. He doesn't compare sin to his path. Luke 14, 31 through 32, or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off, and I will ask for terms of peace. So here, Christ is using a comparison about war. Let me see if I can do the next few. I've been blabbing for a while now. In Luke 22, it's an interesting passage that I would say kind of goes back and forth, because in verses, this is like the prelude to the crucifixion, verses 31 through 38, there's this interesting little passage in the 36 and 37 verses. But now if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag, and if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. And then he passages scripture from the Old Testament. And the disciples come to him and say, "See, Lord, here are 2 swords." And he says that's enough. What does that mean? I'm going to side with, it would be futile for the apostles to resist the crucifixion and resist Jesus being taken, because it was something that had to happen according to God's plan. So Jesus rebukes them for the swords. 10 verses later, we see Peter striking off the ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest. Jesus heals it. And then Jesus says something very interesting in verse 52 to the chief priests and the officers of the noble guard and the elders who had come to him. He says, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have rightly come to me with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me, but this is your hour when darkness reigns." He says that they rightly came to him with swords and clubs as if he was leading a rebellion, implying that it is okay to come to oppose somebody with swords and clubs when someone is leading a rebellion. And then, kind of to wrap up, obviously, Acts 10, Cornelius, the Roman centurion, he has the vision. Or he asks Peter to come to them. Peter has the vision of the blanket coming down from heaven. Peter goes, and Cornelius and his whole household are saved. And none of that does Peter or Christ ever tell Peter to tell Cornelius to stop being a Roman centurion. There's no indication that he stopped becoming a Roman centurion to become a Christian or even afterwards. And then, kind of as a side note to finish off, there's a few passages in the Old Testament like Exodus 32, 22 through 28 and Nehemiah 4, 7 through 27 that are clear definitions in Scripture that it is okay to own weapons of kind of the most efficient weapons for self-defense. So in Exodus 32 and Nehemiah 4, both of those are passages where the Israelites were commanded to get the swords that they owned to defend themselves. So it is not sinful to own weapons of deadly force. And I guess I'll kind of wrap up there because I was talking for a while.
Well, I just wanted to address one thing that Luke said, and then I can let you talk about what William said and what I said. But you brought up the Matthew 5 passage. You specifically did Matthew 5, 38 through 48, and I think there are a lot of points in here that can be addressed, but I wanted to ask you specifically about the first 5 verses that talk about an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek also. So we see Jesus is he's stating what the old law was. So we see Jesus here, he's stating the old law, and then he's in verse 39, he's talking about how he is fulfilling the law, right? We know Jesus came to fulfill the law, and we no longer are only held accountable to the old law, but we're also held accountable to the new law, and we can see that there is a higher standard for us now. So it says, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand your coat over as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow you. So we see a lot of examples that Jesus lists here. And my question to you would be, for this passage, are these literal commands? Is he literally saying that if someone slaps you on the cheek, do you turn and let them slap you on the other cheek? If someone literally wants to borrow money from you in any circumstance, you need to give that person the money that they want to borrow from you. And then the last one was, if someone forcibly says you need to walk 1 mile for whatever reason, does that literally mean that you need to go walk 2 miles with them, like Jesus says here? Or the alternative to that would be, is this an analogy? So what would you say to that? Would you say that this is a literal command from Jesus, or is this an analogy of something, a behavior that he wants us to exhibit?
Well, I mean, okay, sure, sure, this is an example of a behavior type he wants us to exhibit, but I don't think it's an analogy, and that this is a literal command. It is in one of the largest, I think the largest sermon we have from Christ, and is the most clear example of a bunch of his teachings at once. He says, love your enemies, and no matter whether or not you think that if you're slapped on the cheek, you shouldn't get a really turn the other cheek, I can't see loving your enemies as compatible with killing them.
Okay, so sorry, so let me rephrase, not an analogy, but a principle, right? Like you and I both agree that this is like a principle that we need to follow.
But I mean, wouldn't the principle? Those are clear examples of the principle. I think it can both be principle and literal text. I'm not sure if there's anything in the context of that passage that means, because when Christ introduces like a parable or something, he usually makes it pretty clear it's a parable. I don't see any of those indications that show that he is not being literal right here. But at the same time, in the use of self-defense, deadly force, the comparisons that Christ uses here are not if someone attacks you with an intent to kill you. Like, sure, slapping you across the face is not going to be a walk in the park, but it's not if somebody tries to murder you, let them. It's money and walking and a cloak, which I'm going to take very literally, but Christ does not go all the way and say if somebody's trying to kill you, let them.
Right, but what I'm trying to say is the principle of Jesus is clearly is saying here that be overly gracious, right? More than what the culture would expect and more than what the law would demand. We need to be overly gracious in the way we treat others and we respond to situations, right? So he's saying basically don't do what the culture around you would consider appropriate in this kind of circumstance or what they would consider acceptable. So to kind of go off of that point, I think that, and Luke, you said that you don't think it's loving to kill your enemy. You don't think that that's showing love. Well, I think it's really important for us to define what is love. What is showing love to our enemy? From my position, in my opinion, how I view this is when we are defending ourselves against someone who wants to do us harm, and specifically someone who wants to kill us, someone who is exhibiting lethal force, who has the intent to kill us. If we are not defending ourselves, if we are sitting there in a position of vulnerability and we are not trying to protect ourselves, we're actually letting that person fulfill their sinful desires through us. We're letting that person murder us and fulfill their sinful desires. So my question to you would be, is it loving to let someone else fulfill their sinful desires by being by not defending ourselves?
No, it isn't. And I wouldn't. That's not what I'm advocating. If someone was trying to murder me right now, I would run away. I would call the police, but I wouldn't kill them. I don't think, and I know for a fact that sending someone to hell is not loving. Like, once they're dead, if it's a position where it's someone else's life or yours, that you know that you're in a good place with God, that they're not, that then you should give up your own life rather than allow them to kill you.
All right, so then we would take this further. Someone who commits murder, there's a likely chance they'll commit murder again. So if we're letting ourselves be murdered, then is there a possibility for that person to keep someone else from going to heaven? Is there a possibility that they could also be harming someone else?
Potentially. But I don't think, like, I think we can pose all kinds of counterfactuals and hypotheticals here. But in the end, we have a command like love your enemies, do not resist those who persecute you. And I just can't see killing someone as compatible with not resisting them and loving them under any circumstances, no matter what they're doing.
So you said also that if someone was trying to murder you, you would run away. Well, how many scenarios would that even be an option for you? Like if someone had a gun pointed at you, would running away or using non-lethal force save your life?
Quite probably not. And that's like Christ said he sent his disciples out as sheep in the midst of wolves. He didn't say I send you out as wolves in the midst of wolves. We're like, there are times that we have to sacrifice things to fulfill the commands of Christ, and that's just something we can't get around.
Luke, I'm curious to see what you think, kind of taking the discussion more broadly. I'm curious to see what you think about my correlation to the centurions not being commanded to change their jobs with your views on not participating in the military at all.
Yeah, I was hoping to answer this. Let me just answer a few others first. with Moses killing the Egyptians and the stuff from the Mosaic Law, I really don't like. Christ specifically says, It was said to you this, like they used to say this, but I give you this this new commandment." And he says the same thing with like Moses commanded you to give a certificate of divorce, but I say to you, whatever. I think this is an example of where the New Testament is like Christ holds us to a higher standard than he did in the Old. With regarding centurions not using his jobs, if this argument is valid, then prostitution and adultery can also be seen as biblically sanctioned. Prostitutes and adulterers came to Jesus and were forgiven. The Bible doesn't even say that they like went away from their former lives. I think we can all agree that they obviously did. But similarly with Cornelius and other centurions, we can assume that a repentance and a change of position occurred. Indeed, the fact that the New Testament authors go out of their way to describe those furthest from the kingdom, cheaters, fortune tellers, demon possessed, that they're all shown as delivered from their sins and turned to Jesus. It makes it possible that the soldier's story was chosen because his profession was so opposite with Christ's teaching. Other thing I've heard about this is there were early Christians who participated in military service. We know that, and although the majority of the early church fathers had a strong opinion against war, there was a degree to which the Roman army was also like mended the roads and did a lot of non-military duties to the point where people would serve their full 20 years in the army without ever killing someone. So that could have been a possibility for someone, but I think in this case Cornelius did turn away. We just don't read it here.
Okay, so I'm going to call it a false analogy because when adulterers or prostitutes or people like that came to Jesus, he was very clear with them that you need to change. For example, John 8, 1 through 11, woman caught in adultery. Verse 9 through 10, after this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." So I'm not saying just because Christ had an interaction with them, it justifies their action. Christ was very clear. He told lots of people, go and leave your sin when they were and had sinful lives. But there's no mention of that when talking with centurions, either with Christ doing it or with his apostles doing it. And for what you said at the end with like the road building, in modern America, would you think it's okay to be part of the military if you're doing, I mean, not a civilian duty, but or would you say that is not okay to be part of the military because you're still condoning the action of the possibilities of others killing people?
Depends on the job, and it's definitely not an area where it's certainly a very gray area, and an area I wouldn't encourage anyone to go take a desk job in the military at all. I think there could be a position in which it would be all right for someone to stay in their job that they already have. But then regarding your Cornelius statement, I think that's also an argument from silence. What you're making is that you're saying because we don't read that Jesus told, or that Peter told Cornelius to leave his job, he didn't. We don't know that, and we frankly can't generalize based off that.
Would you consider service in the military to a point to be sinful?
Yes. Just
where do you find that obvious command in the New Testament that says it's sinful? Like outside of the passages of like nonviolence, where do you see that? Because here in this John 8 passage to the adulterous woman, Jesus is very clear, what you're doing is sin. You need to go and leave your life of sin. But he doesn't talk in the same way to centurions.
Okay, so I mean, obviously there isn't a passage that says don't go serve in the military, but I think it can be logically deduced from the passage about loving your enemy. There are two verses that I don't know where I can't. Let me see if I can. That I think are really helpful with this kind of thing. It's the two are like the Lord knows them that are His, but let those who name the name of the Lord depart from iniquity. God knows who is with Him, but like, and that's beyond any of us to decide. But those of us who do call ourselves Christians and know we need to depart from iniquity and like do whatever we know we're commanded to do, so far as we're called.
So I would to ask you another question. What do you think there is still such thing as a just cause for war?
So I think there's a difference between at the church between Christians participating in the military and uh, non-Christian and the government going to war. So like, sure, I think that I'm not gonna, like, if there was, during World War II, I wouldn't have been the one going and holding up anti-war signs, because I think the government did have some kind of legitimate right to conduct that war of defense. But then there's certainly such a thing, and I think this is the vast majority of wars, especially now, as an unjust war, where people are being killed for, like, for example, Vietnam is the obvious reason. Thousands upon thousands of people died in Vietnam for because the U.S. was supporting a corrupt regime and thought they were trying to stop communism for 19 years. This led to somewhere around 500,000 dead, I believe, and a lot more wounded. Like, it took a horrific toll, and that's clearly an example of a war that the government had no business prosecuting.
Okay, so to clarify, just to make sure I'm understanding, you believe that there is a different moral code for non-believers than for believers. You believe that non-believers, it's okay for them to be involved in war, but once we become believers, we have a different moral code that we have to follow, and therefore it's not okay for us to be involved in war.
Well, sort of. I mean, non-believers shouldn't be participating in war too, but they aren't following any of the commands of Christ.
So then
and
it would have been better if World War II hadn't happened and we would just have Nazis have taken over the world. That would have been an ideal situation.
no, this is what happened. Someone brings this topic. This situation happens every single time, and I don't know why. If this question is a kind of a weird counterfactual, because it fails to acknowledge the Christian support that Hitler used to gain power. For a short history lesson, Hitler did not have that much power even in 1933. He was a puppet of the right wing, of the conservatives, like the good Christian people, the bankers, the people who went to church or mass every Sunday. They thought, we're going to put this man in power, just stop the communists. And then eventually there was concern because he was being anti-Semitic, whatever. That was justified because of Luther's works 500 years earlier, which advocated violence against the Jews.
Right.
And then based off that, even when he started committing genocide and invading other countries, they were saying things like all the rhetoric. The Lord of Hosts is with us. We shall not be defeated. We're fighting for righteousness. You've probably heard this, but on the Nazis' soldiers' belt buckles, it said "God with us" in German.
Right.
This was a war fought by people who thought themselves Christians. Hitler would not have come to power if Christians had been consistently following Christ's teachings on this.
I'm not. Were also a lot of non-Christians in Germany who supported Hitler, so I'm not sure if you can make that claim. But yes, there were definitely Christians that supported the rise of Nazi Germany. Obviously, the ideal situation there was Hitler never came to power, and Nazi would not have invaded anybody else. But obviously, World War II happened. For me, I'm probably going to take a position kind of between the two of you. There were righteous wars in the past, and those were the wars where God directed Israel to either invade Canaan or defend the territory that they had conquered. In modern day, I'm not seeing much of a case for any war being righteous anymore. Necessary is a different discussion, but something can be necessary from a geopolitical standpoint and also sinful, if that makes sense.
Well, you kind of come to this, you have to confront this issue then of, okay, do you believe I think it's Romans 11 that talks about every authority on this earth is put in place by God. So when you see wars now, do you believe that, like, you don't think that a war could be just even though it's being led by someone put in authority by God?
Just because God puts someone in authority doesn't mean that their acts are justified or in any way are supporting God.
Yeah.
Nero,
Yeah.
Paul wrote those words when Nero was in Rome using Christians
Yep.
as human torches. That was not an act in any way that God supported.
And God put David in command over Israel, and David had an affair with Bathsheba. Now, don't get me wrong, David was a righteous king, but people put in authority by God does not mean that every decision they make in authority is inherently righteous.
Exactly. And again, they're human, right? So we expect these kinds of mistakes to happen, right? We expect
But just because they're mistakes doesn't mean they're not sinful. Right?
No, yes, it's sin is it's unavoidable, but that doesn't make it justified, right? So like it's an unavoidable thing that every leader will make a mistake in war, but that doesn't make it justified, right? So like their actions, we don't think that David was justified in his actions, even though we also know that he was human and sinful. So basically the point that I'm trying to make is like leaders in this world who start wars will inevitably be very sinful human beings and will make mistakes throughout that. However, I don't think we can look at that and say, well, because of that, there can't be a just war anymore. Just because things seem more because the motivations or because the media portrays war as like having these good and bad sides to it, I don't think we can say, oh, there's no such thing as a just war anymore. I firmly believe that there's still a right and wrong side. And yes, the leaders, I think both leaders we can make mistakes and will make mistakes because they're sinful people. However, we see clearly in the Bible and all of these Old Testament examples, or in a majority of Old Testament examples, that during these wars, God was on one side. God was leading one side, and whether or not the leader was a really good person or a really bad person, we see God clearly on one side, and I think that still applies today.
I strongly disagree. So, yeah, I don't know why God has to be on one side. Both sides can be wrong. For example, the American Civil War. Like, okay, let's say God's side. Does God's side always win? If not, that speaks sadly to his omnipotence. In the American Civil War, the more ostensibly righteous side was the Confederate side, the side that lost, and the side that we now think was the bad side, was the bad guys. Or recently in Vietnam, was America the good guy, the North the bad guy? I mean, I'm gonna have a hard time agreeing with that. Even now, this is gonna be a hot take, but in the war with Israel, it's hard to say that Israel's a good guy with its bombings of hospitals and killing of civilians. Like, I can't see that as being a good guy either. I don't think that just because there's a disagreement, one person has to be right and the other has to be wrong. Just as if I said the moon is made out of green cheese and Ethan said the moon is in fact made out of tomato sauce. We would be disagreeing, but we would both be wrong. That just because there's a disagreement doesn't imply that one side is right.
And I think there's still a difference between whether or not a war is just and or justified and whether or not a war is righteous and led by God. There's not going to be a righteous war, because God he doesn't direct his people through a theocracy. I mean, yes, he is the king of all Christians, but no, we don't get direct revelation from him we don't act as a country. So while wars can be justified, for the most, I don't think there's going to be many just wars declared, if any, in the modern day, just because, as Luke is saying, both sides are going to commit sin. And while one side might be right and one side might be wrong, in war, the lines are blurred to such an extent that the best situation, obviously, is if it had never happened in the first place.
So how would you justify the fact that throughout really 2,000 years of Christianity, like, how is all the suffering and evil caused by the Christian church's involvement in war a good thing in any way? Like, the most obvious examples of holy wars in in recent times were the Crusades, which if we're gonna start defending that, that's a whole other discussion. But and then the wars against like the old Prussians in modern day Poland, which were both basically crusades authorized and led by the entire Christian church at the time. Actually, scratch that. By the entire Catholic Church, the entire church in the West at the time. Everyone agreed that those were good things. I guess except the Orthodox were being killed. And those ended up with Christians killing other Christians and committing atrocities in the name of Christ. How do you defend that?
I don't defend that at all because, like I said at the beginning, I'm kind of in a gray area because while I think there are cases for justified killing and self-defense, that none of those situations that you just listed are one of them. It was an attempt to genocide or whatever you want to call it. That's just, you can't defend that from scripture. And I even question the people who are willing to do that and inflict genocides like that. I would 100% be the first one to question whether or not those people, they may have considered themselves Christians, but whether or not they were actually Christians. Because if you're a Christian and willing to inflict a genocide, that's not compatible.
Okay, first I'll be
So
dead
no,
honest.
I don't
Yeah, okay.
defend that at all.
I'll be dead honest. I don't like questioning whether someone is or not a Christian on the whole, because there are a lot of people who I disagree with deeply and think are Christians, including a lot of theologians today, and people who I've had friendly discussions with, and I think they're wrong on a whole bunch of things, but don't think that means they aren't Christians. So my point though is that this doctrine of just war has produced a fruit that there's a Bible verse that says you shall know them by their fruits. Like we can judge things by their results in a lot of ways.
Right.
If this doctrine has such bad results, why do we still like? How do you defend that? I can't think of any other Christian doctrine that has produced this level of bad things in the world.
Well, you can't. Doctrine can be taken any way. Any doctrine can be taken any way and corrupted to become something sinful. And I guess you could say my doctrine is not allowing or agreeing for any of that. I'm not particularly siding with one doctrine or another. I'm just saying what the Bible says and trying to fit myself to the Bible as best I can. So my doctrine isn't going to defend, I think the Bible's doctrine isn't going to defend anything like genocide or the examples that you mentioned, like crusades or things like that, because you can't, that's not it is a doctrine of some people, but I don't think that it's a doctrine compatible with Scripture based on the verses that you've read and we've all discussed today. So, no, I don't defend that doctrine at all. I'm looking at the other passages for self-defense and justified killing, not in the same sense that you wage wars.
Okay, so I think I understand. Is your position that you think that the doctrine of just wars that's usually stated today is mostly wrong, but you mostly disagree with me in terms of self-defense stuff?
Correct.
Okay.
So to kind of summarize, and William, I don't know if I'm accurately representing your position, so tell me if I am, but we would agree that a war that is fought in order to protect people who are under imminent threat either the people who we know or the people in our country. If we're fighting a war to protect them from an imminent threat, that would be an example, or that could be an example of a just war. In the example of the Crusades, those were not fought in order to protect people from an imminent threat. There was no threat that they were protecting their people from. Instead, we see that it was done in order to further the gospel in an illegitimate way that we know is not actually how the gospel can be spread. I could be wrong about that, but yeah, what are your thoughts?
I see it more less of a war and more of like a case by case scenario. If somebody is coming from my family, yes, I'm going to defend my family to the best of my ability. But there's a difference between justifying that and literal self-defense, and I think the extreme example of, because the argument for self-defense is also perverted in war to drive militaries to do. So, for example, modern day, China, one of their arguments for taking Taiwan is its self-defense because they see Taiwan as a threat, and so in defending, they're trying to justify the action of wanting to take Taiwan with self-defense. So, can a war be fought off self-defense? Sure. Am I going to be more willing to fight a war or defend my family? I'm going to be more willing to defend my family, if that makes sense. And we have been going on for an hour, so I'm not sure how much more people want to listen to us talk, so it might be good to start.
Quick historical note. If we're going to defend any war, I think the Crusades are the most justifiable war of any to defend. Here's why. Just, if you think that, North and South, for example, Civil War, the South is holding slaves, and it's doing bad things to people's lives here and now. On the other hand, if you take the view of just war, the Crusades can be justified because the Muslims were destroying people's souls. They were teaching false doctrine and making it so people would go to hell. If we're going to start justifying wars, the Crusade is a pretty easy one to justify. Therefore, I have a hard time thinking that any war basically since Christ gave his teachings on loving your enemy has been justified.
Okay, so basically to wrap up kind of my position on this issue, I would say a lot of partly personal opinion, but also just looking at the Bible and looking at the sanctity of human life and seeing how God values human life. To defend people against groups or another side in a war that seeks to destroy human life. Like, how do I put this in a good way? Like, when we're talking about this issue as a whole, there are so many circumstances in the Old Testament and also I think even in our modern world today where we see you have a group of people who are looking to commit unjust acts, to do these terrorist acts against another country, and basically they don't care about human life. They don't believe in the sanctity of human life, and therefore they're trying to end human life and do evil things. And then you have the other side of this argument where there are people who get the choice. Either they get to protect their country, they get to protect these people from those inhumane acts, from these murders and these terrorists by fighting them and by, yes, justified killing, in order to save and protect the innocent people that live in their country who could be subject to these brutal attacks. Or you have the option of they sit out, they don't do anything to protect the people in their country end up getting killed by this other country that thinks they're doing it in the name of their religion, their false religion, or in the name of a leader that they follow, or whatever the reason is. To me, the sanctity of human life and the call in the Bible for us to protect that is first and foremost. And so somebody who has the intent on murdering someone else, automatically forfeits their right to life. Someone who wants to murder someone else forfeits their right to life, because they do not value the sanctity of human life. And so if I had to say my biggest reason for justified killing, that would be it. Somebody who wants to end someone else's life forfeits their right to life, because they do not value the sanctity of human life, the way God shows us to in the Bible. So yeah, you guys can address that if you want to. But yeah, I would just close with that.
Just quick response to the forfeiting their life. Maybe yes, from like a legal standpoint, but from a Christian standpoint, doesn't that person need the gospel even more? If they're inside a bad place, doesn't that give us an extra reason to try to teach them rather than just killing them and make them lose any chance they had at eternal life?
Yeah, Paul.
No, because keeping it, because I would say no, because letting that person continue to live is putting other people at risk. Other people who could also, and potentially those other people that could, so like I'm thinking mainly of like a terrorist, okay? If we have the option to kill a terrorist, if we leave that person alive, he is going to inevitably kill other people who also are losing their opportunity for salvation. And so we have to choose, right? You are choosing between, do you leave someone alive who, yes, there's a possibility that they could come to salvation. There's a possibility they could go to heaven. Or do you leave them alive, and these other people who are put at risk, they automatically lose their potential, their ability to go to heaven. So like you have to choose between two. You have to choose between two evils.
You have to be very careful with that, because the Apostle Paul was murdering Christians, and his life was spared, and the Christians did not kill him when he came to arrest and kill Christians. And then he became one of the most important Christian leaders of our faith. So you have to be careful saying that, but I see where you're coming from.
Right, and I'm not saying like, okay, every single person who's murdered someone else automatically deserves, like, I believe God has a plan, and he could work through those people if he chose to, but I'm saying our responsibility is to protect people. And so if we're given the opportunity to protect people, we should take it. Now, could God use someone to bring that murderer to salvation? That's a possibility. I think that is a possibility. But I think their life, you're basically you are, and I know this is not really where you want this to go, but like you are choosing whose life is more of a priority. Is the murderer's life more a priority, or is the people that he could potentially affect more a priority? And if it's a case of self-defense, you're saying, is the person who's coming to try and kill me, is their life more a priority, or is mine? And it's really hard to say inherent human value. Everyone has inherent human value. There's no one person that is more valuable than the other. However, I think from a biblical standpoint, we can see that, like, I was thinking about the Matthew 13 passage where he's talking about some seed will fall on like the rocky ground, some seed will fall on the path, and some seed will produce like 30, 60, and 90 fold, right? Like you are left to determine, okay, whose life is more of a priority, who can benefit more. And yeah, I mean, that's a really sticky like place to be in. But I think if you look at the biblical evidence, and you look at, okay, in self-defense, I'm talking about specifically, but like if you are trying to defend yourself against a murderer, you know that 100% you're going to reproduce. Everybody on this call, you guys are Christians, you guys are sharing the gospel, you 100% are going to reproduce like in that story, like Jesus said. But the murderer, there's a chance they could be saved just like Paul and reproduce just as much. But there's also very likely a chance that they will fall on the path, never hear the gospel, and also continue to keep other people from reaching heaven. So this argument has to go there. It has to go to whose life is more whose life has more potential. And then based off of that, I would take my position of someone who can help other people getting to heaven would take priority over the murderer's life.
Whose life had more potential? Christ's or the world?
Well, Christ was meant to die. So we can't use Christ as our example. Christ came to the earth to die. So that was his potential on earth. He was meant to die. He had to die.
He could have, like, it literally, he says, I could have called legions of angels to destroy the world and free me. Or maybe he doesn't say that precisely, but Christian means like little Christ. Christians are called to imitate Christ and live like him. That can include dying rather than killing others. Even if it doesn't seem like it's a good call now, in the light of eternity, we'll see it differently.
But Christ was the ultimate sacrifice in order that we didn't have to be. I mean, that's why he died. He died in order that, like, his example, we want to follow his example, but okay. Anyways, I think this is a point that we the next episode. I feel like this is gonna go on forever if I don't stop it. But yes, that's a good point. I think we'll address that in the next episode. And yeah, stay tuned for part 2 of Justified Killing.
Lily, you have some icebreaker questions for us so that we can put this episode to rest?
Yes, I do. First one, which I think is the best one I've ever found. If you could only communicate through interpretive dance or kazoo solos, which would you choose?
Oh my goodness. That's the stupidest icebreaker I've ever heard.
That is actually awesome.
I would say interpretive dance, because then I could do like sign language. I feel like people wouldn't understand anything that I did on a kazoo?
Yeah.
I feel like that wouldn't work.
I'm going to go with the kazoo just because people don't want to see me try to interpretive dance.
Fair enough.
That's fair.
I would go be a monastic and not talk for the rest of my life, like the desert fathers or whatever. Just go live in a cave somewhere and write and read and pray, and just not talk.
All right, next question. Would you rather have spaghetti as your hair or maple syrup for sweat?
Whoa!
Gross, Lily.
I got some
Gosh.
good ones this week.
I'm going to go with the maple syrup for sweat just because if you live in Dallas, Texas, and you experience 105 to 110 degree weather with 90% humidity, which should be inherently paradoxical, but it's not, then yeah, you're already pretty sticky.
You can't complain around me, William, because we have it worse. I would say for me, it would be spaghetti as hair, because my hair would never be frizzy. That would be like such a blessing, actually. So yeah, I would say spaghetti as hair.
That's awesome.
I would say these are terrible icebreaker questions, but I would choose spaghetti as hair.
Agreed.
Terrible. These are amazing.
Luke, Elise said, Luke, would it be blonde spaghetti? Oh, wait.
It would be angel hair pasta.
Aw, you're so holy.
All right, let's see. Let's pick a last one. What conspiracy theory would you start just to confuse people?
Every time an animal runs in the United States, an earthquake happens in a third world country.
That's oddly specific.
Probably so. There are as many hydrogen atoms in a water mo- There are as many oxygen atoms in a water molecule as there are stars in the solar system.
Nice.
I like that one.
Nice.
Oh gosh. I'm not this smart, guys. I don't even like I believe in a lot of conspiracy theories because they're not conspiracy theories.
Like Bigfoot.
That's not a conspiracy theory. If he kills someone, you're first. I'm just kidding. He doesn't kill people. He's nice.
Oh my word.
I think here's my conspiracy theory that builds off another conspiracy theory. I think that there is a Nessie has cousins that live in every single country. So there's some lake in every single country that has a Loch Ness.
The Vatican Loch Ness monster is that's something.
Yep. I think every country has one, and they just have a different name for it. You know what would be better is all of the lakes that Nessie lives in are actually like they're teleportation lakes. So like people cite him all the time, but they just go like to different countries through their lakes. That's why you can never find it. Listen, that's a real one. You guys can get behind it.
Wow.
All right. I think there's multiple reasons that y'all will hear, and some other reasons that you will not see, thankfully, about why this episode needs to wrap up. Thank y'all for listening this week. I hope you had a fun time. Tune in next week to hear part 2 or 3. We'll see how Lee splits up the episodes of this series on justified killing and self-defense, starring Elise, Timothy, and Ethan. And we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.